When I first saw the trailers and presentations for Godfall, I was interested in how this game was aiming to make its mark on the looter-type genre. Most of the games revolve around first and third-person shooters. With Godfall focusing on melee combat, this sparked my interest further. After the game came out, critics were pretty harsh on it. Many stated that it had a lackluster story, and fell into many of the same flaws as many games of this type at launch. While critics were presenting these flaws, they kept stating that the combat was solid and the best part about the game. As the game reached more people, issues were brought up related to the combat system. With all of this surrounding the game, my interest in it actually grew. If you've watched any of my videos on my channel, I tend to go against what the mainstream games media is saying. I generally find them lazy in their execution, and in many cases they use the game to push an agenda. I was curious if Godfall was going to turn into a potentially underrated game with how the media was acting. As I spent more and more time with Godfall, I sadly found many issues with the experience while also seeing the potential of it. The most damaging aspect of the game was the unresponsive combat and issues with defensive moves and not canceling your attacks so that you can have better input and less lag. Honestly, if Godfall had more responsive combat, I would easily be making a case to try this one out on a sale. But sadly, in its current state, Godfall definitely needs more work. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you my review for Godfall. Before we go into the many flaws within the game, let me break down the gameplay. On a basic level, you have your light and heavy attacks. You can mix and match these to create different combos. Some are pretty cool as well, with how the dual swords will swing out like a whip and hit all of the foes around you. You get a nice variety of different weapons to choose from that feel and act differently. The dual swords are very fast weapons, and then you have the spear for thrusting attacks or the warhammer for slow but heavy hits. To the game's credit, it does a good job at providing different weapons to use and finding your own style. Thankfully, you can carry two weapons at once, so this lends itself for you to stick with an old favorite along with experimenting with something new. When it comes to landing your hits, the combat does have some decent impact from how the weapons feel along with their sound effects. You also have a few options for defense as well. You can pull up your shield to block attacks. Along with this, if you can time your block right as the enemy is about to hit you, then you can parry their attack. There is a useful evasive roll as well. Then you have your other moves to keep in mind. Your light attacks do not do a lot of damage, but they can build up a bunch of damage that you can then land on an opponent if you follow up a bunch of light attacks with a heavy attack. Each of the enemies also have a stagger bar that your attacks will help to build up. Once an enemy is staggered, you can perform a takedown on them. You have a few shield moves as well, where you can throw a shield at an enemy or use it as a means to hit many foes. The most powerful of your moves are the special moves that each of the unique pieces of armor has. These can enhance your attacks or spawn allies to help you out to take out a large amount of enemies. In concept, the combat is pretty good. When the game is working, I did enjoy slashing at enemies, but the combat has many issues. The biggest issue with the game is how unresponsive the combat feels. If you are in the middle of a combo and you want to quickly evade or block an attack, the game will not recognize your inputs for evading or blocking. This actively makes the game feel like it is working against you as you take damage that you would otherwise be able to dodge if the game worked correctly. You are usually up against several enemies at once, so you really need to rely on your block and evade to not die. So this sort of delayed inputs could honestly work if you were always in regular one-on-one fights where you really need to calculate your moves and choose wisely. I actually found some of the earlier one-on-one fights with normal enemies to be fun, and I was able to better manage the delay in inputs. Even though these situations were better early on, it didn't solve the issue that whenever I hit the heal button, there was a 50% chance that the game would not register my input. And I would heal or the game would ignore it and I wouldn't heal, resulting in me dying. Like I said, your shield is very important as it helps to block your attacks and parry an enemy. But when the game will not register your inputs to block, how am I supposed to fully use the blocking and parrying system within this game? Another issue with the combat is how you are up against several enemies at once, and the game uses these small indicators to identify when an enemy is going to attack who is not right in front of you. It would have been better if the game used another means to provide information to the player rather than using these small and hard to read indicators. On top of all of this, the game will have frequent lag spikes where the game will completely stop and then resume the action. This completely ruins the flow of the game and is not what you would expect from a next-gen title. I could tolerate if there was some slowdown while exploring an open area, but these lag spikes make some of the action sequences feel so stop and go. There will be points where you're trying to enjoy the action and then the game will just stop. This will also happen when you are picking up an item or opening up a chest or even mid-combo. While the game has a solid soundtrack and a gorgeous look to it, the combat makes the game feel like an example of a bad early access title. Now on top of the combat being unresponsive, Godfall has other issues present as well. During each of the missions and the open area sections, you may die in combat. When you respawn, the enemies will not be at full health, but rather whatever you left them off at. This means that on the normal difficulty, you can just continually spawn back in and slowly hack away at the enemies without any urgency to them. This took out all the tension from these sequences. The missions themselves are not that interesting either. They mainly have you kill a set amount of enemies, collect certain items, or destroy an item. The most fun I had was when I was within the open areas and just looking for some chests. The missions have a repetitive structure where you need to collect a certain amount of a certain item to be able to fight a boss. This is repeated throughout the entire campaign and it gets old really quick. I had other issues like the aiming icon staying on during a cutscene, my HUD completely disappearing and then returning, and then an enemy getting stuck in a pillar. And Godfall has a lot of stability problems because the game crashed on me several times. While the story is also lackluster, to the game's credit, the first cutscene is pretty good, even though I had a sound bug so some of the sound effects were off. The story has a simple premise where you get defeated by your brother and then you're trying to find a way to defeat his lieutenants and then him. Where the game could have told a fun story about the main character overcoming adversity, the main narrative does nothing interesting with this concept. Each of the boss fights have very little build up to them, and they are not that memorable from a character standpoint. This is honestly a good story concept for a video game, but Godfall doesn't do anything with this. It didn't need to be the most in-depth narrative to be good, but more effort in this area would have been appreciated. Honestly, I could have tolerated all these lackluster areas if the combat was actually good. Godfall does a pretty good job of providing continual rewards through the different pieces of loot that you will find, along with picking new skills through your level ups. But the minute-to-minute combat is an exercise in frustration as you wish the game controlled better. If you only improved the combat and it was responsive, then the minute-to-minute action would be solid with the good rewards and lackluster in other areas, but at least the focus of the game would be good. But as it stands, Godfall is beautiful to look at, but a mess to play. I had a wealth of issues with this game, but I do want to conclude this section on a bit of a high note. The soundtrack is one of the better areas of the game. Here are a few tracks from the game. Godfall is a very messy title. It has odd glitches that shows its unpolished nature. The level structure and campaign are very ho-hum in its execution, presenting the been there done that sort of feel. The story is not engaging and feels very underdeveloped. But the worst aspect about the game is the unresponsive combat. It is extremely frustrating to have a combat system that requires you to fight several foes at once, but the game will not always register your blocks and evades and whenever you need to heal. With the combat in its current state, it feels downright broken and something I would expect from a pre-alpha build of a game. The combat system also feels like it was never play-tested, as the unresponsive nature of the game would be obvious to anyone who got past the tutorial section of the game. If the developers want to save their game and provide a second chance to it, then I would suggest that they focus all of their efforts on improving the combat. The game also needs a good amount of stability improvements, but the unresponsive combat is the most damaging aspect of the game. If Godfall's combat receives improvements in that area, then this might turn out to be a fun title that you can enjoy on a very deep sale. Overall, with Godfall in its current state, I cannot recommend this game, and thank you very much for watching.